Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something that might just make you yawn in the best possible way. Imagine a time over 4,000 years ago where everything around you was wild and unpredictable. The land is dry, the air is hot, and every corner holds the potential for a skirmish, a robbery, or an injustice. But amidst all this chaos, there's a civilization that actually managed to keep the peace. You probably won't survive the suspense of how this ancient system worked, but bear with me. This is some relaxing history after all. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I want to know where you're listening from too. Drop your location and the local time in the comments. It helps me feel like I'm traveling through time with you. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's start in ancient Sumer, where life wasn't all sand and mud. Well, actually it was, but there was a little more. In this sprawling, arid region between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, the Sumerians were crafting one of the first civilizations. But more than just creating the world's first cities, they were developing something far more crucial: a peaceful way to govern themselves. In those days, it was typical for city-states to be in constant turmoil. Rulers fought over territory, families bickered over property, and you couldn't trust a neighbor not to rob you blind. But the Sumerians, they had a different plan. They were going to use a peaceful judicial system to create stability. And honestly, you might not expect it from a civilization that gave us things like the ziggurat, but they got it right. Let's imagine this world: dusty streets, clay tablets, and the constant buzz of people arguing in the marketplace. You, an average Sumerian, might have been at the center of that, but if something went wrong, if you felt someone wronged you, you could actually turn to something called justice. Now, don't get too excited, because we're not talking about anything glamorous like courtroom dramas with heated debates and perfect logic. Nope, this was a system designed to be practical, calm, and perhaps a little boring, but in the best possible way. So picture this: a peaceful night under the stars, everything calm after a busy day. But how does a society remain peaceful when chaos is always lurking around the corner? The answer lies in something you'd barely notice if you didn't pay attention: the judicial system that kept people calm and orderly. We're not talking about wild punishments or brutal rulers here. Instead, we're diving into how the Sumerians used their laws to create a society where everyone knew what was right and wrong. As you drift into sleep, imagine how they might have laid the groundwork for the peaceful society you're hearing about now. It's all in the details. Let's drift a little deeper into the world of ancient Sumer. Imagine the sun rising over a world that's just waking up to its own greatness. The ground is cracked underfoot, the sky a harsh, bright blue, and all around, the sounds of daily life, trading, gossiping, and the faint hum of life fill the air. But what sets this civilization apart from the others in this chaotic world is not just its agriculture or its trade networks. It's the way they decided to keep the peace. How did the Sumerians go about it? By laying down the foundation of a system that was, in its own way, incredibly modern. Sumer, this fertile crescent of civilization, was born out of necessity. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers were unpredictable at best, and the surrounding deserts were unforgiving. The Sumerians didn't just need to build a city. They had to build something that could withstand natural disasters, invasions, and internal strife. That's where law and order came in. It wasn't just about protection. It was about creating a structure that would help people live their lives without constant fear of chaos. Historians still argue whether Sumer was the absolute birthplace of organized law, or whether other, smaller tribes had already begun creating similar systems. But one thing is clear: Sumer was the first civilization that actively wrote down its laws, ensuring a more structured and peaceful society. We're talking about something that didn't exist anywhere else at the time, laws that were actually codified, written, and publicly known. These laws weren't some vague, whispered rules from the king. They were clear, they were visible, and they applied to everyone. You could say that it was the first step toward the rule of law. The idea that laws should apply to all people, not just the elite, is something we take for granted today. But back then, it was a revolutionary concept. The Sumerians began to establish settlements with a clear hierarchy, but with a common agreement that rules should govern everyone, rulers and citizens alike. That's a pretty profound leap forward. Of course, this wasn't a perfect system. In fact, it had its share of challenges. There were still kings and priests who had more power than the average citizen. And while the laws were written down, there wasn't always a perfect way to enforce them. Still, there was something revolutionary about the fact that, unlike many other cultures of the time, Sumerians weren't just relying on oral traditions or the whims of rulers to decide who was right and wrong. They were creating something more permanent. Picture this. You're walking through the bustling marketplace, or maybe you're sitting under the cool shade of a palm tree. The sound of a faint argument drifts in the air, but it's not the type of dispute you'd expect. It's a calm discussion, one that seems to have a resolution already in place. You could almost hear the hum of the city's legal system working quietly in the background, as everyone around you knows exactly what to expect in any dispute. So while everything around you might seem a bit disorganized, the laws of Sumer were starting to provide a framework for peaceful resolutions. It wasn't a perfect system, but it was a start, a calming influence in a world that often didn't feel very calm at all. And while we might laugh at how we imagine those days, we can see how essential this calm structure was to the Sumerians, especially when things started to get more complicated as the civilization expanded. Now, let's travel a bit deeper into the heart of Sumer's thriving cities. Look at the towering ziggurats, the muddy streets teeming with people, and the sound of farmers trading their grain for pottery or tools. In the midst of all this, Sumer wasn't just busy creating a bustling economy or perfecting the art of irrigation. They were building something much subtler, but equally important, a society that functioned in its own way like a well-oiled machine. You see, in Sumer, society was divided into distinct classes, each playing a role in keeping things running smoothly. But these roles, no matter how high or low, were all bound by one thing: a set of rules enforced by a peaceful judicial system. As you wander through the streets, imagine the complexity of the society around you. There were the kings, the priests, the scribes, the merchants, and of course, the farmers who formed the backbone of everything. But despite all these different layers, the Sumerians still managed to find a balance, because they knew that in order for a society to stay peaceful, everyone had to play by the same rules. Historians still argue whether Sumer's system was more about maintaining power or truly promoting peace. After all, the priests had significant control, and many of the laws were said to be divinely inspired. But as we dig deeper into how things worked, it's clear that Sumer was one of the first to create something that we would recognize today as a social contract, an agreement between the rulers and the ruled. At the top, you had the king, who often acted as a mediator between the gods and the people. Below him, the priest played a key role in keeping everything in balance, ensuring the people followed the laws that, in theory, were handed down from the gods. These laws weren't just about punishing criminals, they were about ensuring harmony and order. But as any good historian would tell you, the question remains: was Sumer truly a peaceful place for all, or were there hidden tensions? Sure, there was order, but there was also a deep underlying hierarchy. The elite had access to legal privileges the common folk didn't. It wasn't a perfect utopia, but for the time, it was revolutionary. The Sumerians were trying, at least, to create a world where everyone knew their place and understood the consequences of their actions. Now, let's look at the structure of Sumer's courts and legal system. In those early days, courts didn't have the dramatic flair we imagine today. No gavel-banging judges or heated lawyer speeches. Instead, justice was administered by a judge or a priest who would hear the case and make a decision. The entire process was designed to be orderly and, most importantly, peaceful. Sumerians didn't need the kind of chaotic displays we might expect in a lawless society. Instead, disputes would often be settled by mediation, with an emphasis on restoring peace rather than punishing offenders. This approach is something that seems so basic to us now, but back then, it was revolutionary. Can you imagine a society where a simple conversation could actually resolve conflict? In Sumer, the judicial process wasn't about a power struggle. It was about balancing scales. It wasn't about being right or wrong in the traditional sense. It was about restoring harmony. And as you walk through these ancient streets with the sounds of daily life humming all around you, you realize something. The legal system wasn't some grand spectacle, but an invisible force that kept everyone on track. It worked quietly in the background, giving everyone the space to live their lives while knowing that peace could always be found, even in the midst of the messiness of everyday existence. As we step further into the depths of Sumerian society, we come to a moment where the relationship between religion and law becomes ever clearer. In Sumer, the gods didn't just reside in temples or in the minds of priests. They were woven into the very fabric of everyday life. For the Sumerians, the idea of justice wasn't something that came from a secular ruler or a distant king. It was divinely inspired, a direct command from the gods themselves. So, as you stroll down the dusty streets of Ur or Lagash, consider this. Every law you followed wasn't just to avoid punishment. It was a matter of pleasing the divine. Historians still debate how much of Sumer's legal system was directly influenced by religious beliefs versus the political need to maintain order and control. Some argue that the religious foundation was more about keeping the masses in check, while others believe that the divine role in Sumer's laws genuinely helped preserve peace. Whichever side you lean toward, one thing is certain. Religion played a central role in creating a sense of order, balance, and, dare I say it, calm in the land of Sumer. Imagine this for a second. You're sitting in a temple, the flickering light of oil lamps casting shadows on the stone walls, and priests are performing a ritual meant to invoke divine favor. Now, take this feeling of reverence and multiply it by every legal decision, every dispute, and every punishment in Sumer. That's the power the gods held in this society. To break the law wasn't just to offend the king, it was to offend the very forces that shape the universe. In a society like this, a peaceful judicial system wasn't simply a matter of human law. It was about keeping favor with the gods and ensuring that the cosmic order remained intact. To the Sumerians, breaking the law was more than a civil infraction. It was a spiritual misstep that could have consequences far beyond this life. The divine presence in the judicial system wasn't just symbolic, it was practical. If you wanted peace, you had to follow the divine order that governed everything. But how did this divine connection affect the way disputes were handled? Well, for one thing, trials were seen as an opportunity to connect with the gods, and the judgment rendered was believed to be a direct reflection of divine will. That meant no trial was ever just a mundane affair. It was a chance to prove your worthiness in the eyes of the gods. So, when disputes arose, it wasn't just about winning or losing. It was about restoring cosmic harmony. Imagine that. Your every word in court could either earn divine approval or bring down disaster. Yet, while the Sumerians might have believed their judicial system was grounded in divine law, the reality was far from perfect. As with any system of governance, there were imperfections. Historians often argue whether these religiously influenced laws truly provided the equality they seem to promise. After all, not everyone had the same access to divine favor or the legal system, and the priests and kings were still the ones making the final call. But even with its flaws, there was something incredibly calming about the way the Sumerians relied on their faith to govern. So, as we continue through the streets of Sumer, imagine that everything around you, the laws, the structures, even the air, is infused with this divine purpose. It wasn't just about keeping order, it was about aligning with the gods and maintaining a peaceful world order. For the Sumerians, justice was cosmic, eternal, and peaceful, far from the chaotic, random decisions we might think of today. Now that we've settled into the rhythm of Sumer's divine-inspired judicial system, let's dive into one of the most significant milestones in ancient law, the Code of Ur-Nammu. This ancient code was one of the first legal frameworks to be written down in history, and while it wasn't quite as famous as Hammurabi's later code, it laid the groundwork for the orderly society we've been talking about. In a world where justice was often defined by the whims of kings or the anger of the gods, Ur-Nammu's code was an attempt to bring some structure to the chaos. Historians still debate whether Ur-Nammu was the true inventor of this legal code or whether it was an evolution of older systems. Some believe that Ur-Nammu's code was more about consolidating pre-existing laws, while others argue that it was the first true attempt at formalizing a legal system for an entire society. Either way, Ur-Nammu's code is fascinating because it reflects that same peaceful judicial intention we've seen so far. It was less about brutal punishment and more about restoring balance. Imagine a world where the law isn't just a tool for punishment, but a mechanism for peace. The Code of Ur-Nammu was based on the idea that if you committed a crime, you were expected to pay restitution. Punishment wasn't arbitrary, and it certainly wasn't violent. It was about compensation. For instance, if someone damaged another person's property, they would have to repair or replace it with the value agreed upon by the local judges. This was a huge departure from the chaotic systems of law found in other parts of the world, where violence often led to further violence. The Code of Ur-Nammu didn't just focus on criminal laws, it also addressed social and economic matters, such as the payment of debts, the treatment of slaves, and the inheritance of property. And here's the quirky part. One of the laws stated that if someone committed a murder, they were required to pay a fine to the family of the victim. This wasn't a way of excusing murder, but rather a way of maintaining social harmony by compensating the victim's family, rather than seeking revenge. It's a fascinating glimpse into how ancient societies sought to minimize conflict and encourage peaceful resolutions. Yet, there are still debates about how effective Ur-Nammu's code was in practice. Was it truly able to keep the peace, or were there cracks in the system? Was it just a way to control the people and ensure that the elite had the upper hand? Despite these questions, the Code of Ur-Nammu is widely regarded as one of the first attempts to introduce a legal structure based on fairness and balance, rather than on fear and coercion. And for a society like Sumer, where every action could have divine consequences, creating a legal system based on compensation and fairness was a huge step toward lasting peace. So, as you sit there, drifting into sleep, imagine the ancient Sumerians sitting in the warm shade of a palm tree with a small clay tablet in hand, writing down laws designed not to punish, but to restore balance. The simplicity of it, the calm of it, is almost enough to make you forget how chaotic the world around them must have been. But that was the genius of Ur-Nammu's code. It provided a sense of order, something people could trust, and most importantly, it kept the peace. Now that we've explored Ur-Nammu's code, let's step forward in time a bit to the more well-known, yet equally peaceful, Code of Hammurabi. While Ur-Nammu's code set the stage, Hammurabi's code took the concept of written law and made it much more visible, engraving it into stone tablets for all to see. And although Hammurabi was much later in the timeline, his system was profoundly influenced by the Sumerian judicial framework. So, let's see how Hammurabi built on the peaceful legal system of Sumer. Picture this: ancient Babylon, the sun setting over a city of towering walls and grand temples. The land is filled with people from all walks of life: farmers, merchants, kings, and priests. And at the center of it all, on a massive stone stele, is Hammurabi's famous code. For the people of Babylon, this wasn't just a set of laws. It was a public declaration of peace. Hammurabi's message was clear: the laws I set are divine in origin and meant to maintain harmony. As with Sumer, religion and law were inextricably tied. The idea was that the gods wanted their people to live in peace and order, so Hammurabi's code was written to reflect that divine will. Now, historians still argue about whether Hammurabi's code was more about enforcing justice or cementing Hammurabi's own power. Some say it was a political tool used to make Hammurabi seem like a godlike figure in the eyes of his people. Others point to the code's focus on fairness and restitution as evidence of his genuine desire to create a just society. Whatever the intention, the message was clear. Law and order were not just the king's domain, but a divine right, something the gods had entrusted to Hammurabi as a way to keep peace in his kingdom. One of the most fascinating aspects of Hammurabi's code was the emphasis on restitution rather than punishment. Much like the Sumerians before him, Hammurabi's laws were less about punishing the guilty and more about making things right. For example, if you caused someone harm, you weren't necessarily going to be punished. You were expected to make amends by compensating the victim. In some cases, that meant paying a fine. In others, it meant providing a service. This idea of eye for an eye wasn't about literal vengeance. It was about restoring balance and peace in a way that didn't escalate violence. But what about the an eye for an eye part that's so often quoted in popular culture? Well, while it's true that Hammurabi's code does mention harsh punishments, the focus was still on making the situation right for both parties. In fact, many of the laws were designed to ensure that justice was proportionate. If a person caused harm, the penalty was directly related to the damage done, rather than arbitrary punishment. This, again, was an effort to maintain peace and avoid the kind of retaliatory violence that might spiral out of control. In a world where conflict was all too common, this was a radical attempt to keep the peace. However, historians do argue about the fairness of some of the laws. Some critics point out that the punishments for the lower classes were often much harsher than those for the elite. For example, a free person might pay a fine for a crime, but a slave could be subjected to much harsher treatment. This reflects a fundamental inequality in the system, one that was common in ancient societies. Still, despite these flaws, Hammurabi's code left behind a legacy of written law that would echo through history. And while Sumer's peaceful judicial system laid the groundwork, Hammurabi brought it into the public eye, engraving it in stone for all to see and follow. As you settle deeper into your sleep, think about the sheer scale of this achievement. Hammurabi's code wasn't just a collection of rules. It was an expression of peace, a public promise that justice would be served fairly, and a declaration that everyone, from the highest to the lowest, was subject to the same laws. Imagine walking through the streets of Babylon, your eyes occasionally catching sight of that great stone stele, a reminder that peace was, at least on some level, possible. As we continue through the rich landscape of ancient Babylon, we're reminded that Hammurabi's code wasn't just a series of laws carved into stone. It was a real, functioning part of society, a quiet yet powerful force that kept the peace. The legal system wasn't simply about punishing the guilty, but also about maintaining stability and fairness across Babylon's bustling streets and complex society. And much like Sumer, the role of judges and courts in Hammurabi's time was central to ensuring that things didn't spiral out of control. Step into one of Babylon's courthouses and imagine the scene. The room would be a simple yet grand structure, with judges sitting on raised platforms, eyes scanning the scrolls before them. There would be scribes writing down every word, preserving the records for future generations, ensuring that each case was meticulously documented. The judges, most likely priests or nobles, didn't just hold their position because of their knowledge of law. They were seen as intermediaries between the gods and the people. Just like in Sumer, religion played a crucial role in the judicial process. In fact, many of the cases brought before the court involved a blend of legal and religious matters, such as disputes over property, marriage, or contracts, all of which were considered to have divine implications. Historians still argue about how involved the gods were in the actual process of judging cases. Did the judges really consider divine will when making their decisions, or was it just a tool to legitimize their authority? There's no clear answer, but it's likely that the divine aspect of justice was crucial in maintaining order. People would have believed that by following the judge's decisions, they were not only adhering to human law, but also to the will of the gods. This made the legal system both fairer and more sacred, which is why it was so effective in keeping the peace. People knew they had to respect the laws, not just to avoid punishment, but to stay in harmony with the cosmos. But how were disputes actually settled? Unlike today's courtrooms, where lawyers argue their cases, the Sumerian and Babylonian judicial systems were far more straightforward. There wasn't a dramatic back and forth between two parties. Instead, a judge would listen to both sides and deliver a verdict, often based on the written laws, much like a referee ensuring the game is played fairly. If you stole something, for instance, you might be required to return the stolen goods and pay restitution. In the case of a murder, the compensation wasn't a simple payment, but an agreement to restore peace, usually involving the family of the victim. This sense of proportionality in legal outcomes helped create a stable society where the goal was not to create winners and losers, but to restore balance. The quiet but important role of scribes can't be overlooked either. Imagine, while the judgment is being read aloud, the scribe records everything, ensuring that there is a written account of each case. These records were vital in keeping the system organized and transparent. Scribes were the ones who kept track of disputes, debts, and punishments, preserving the integrity of the legal system. Without them, there would be no way to ensure that everyone knew the rules, or that justice had been served. Of course, no system is perfect. Historians note that despite these checks and balances, there were still flaws in the system. For example, the law was often harsher for slaves than for free citizens. A crime committed by a slave, even if it was minor, could lead to severe punishment, while a similar offense by a free person might result in just a fine. Some critics argue that the legal system was designed more to protect the elite than the common people. Still, the fact that laws were written down and consistently applied was an enormous step forward in human civilization. So, imagine this world once again. A steady hum of voices in the background, people walking from market to home, knowing that if they had a dispute, there was a process, peaceful, ordered, and structured, to resolve it. It's a world where legal systems, often seen as distant and cold today, were once at the heart of keeping the entire society calm and functioning smoothly. The ancient Sumerians and Babylonians knew that the key to a peaceful society wasn't just about punishing the guilty. It was about ensuring that everyone knew the rules and followed them, restoring balance in every case, big or small. As we continue this quiet journey through the legal world of Sumer and Babylon, we come to a crucial aspect of their judicial systems: punishments. While we've painted a picture of a peaceful society, free from the chaotic violence often associated with lawless times, the reality of crime was that it still existed. What happened when a law was broken? How did the Sumerians and Babylonians respond to crime? And did their methods truly maintain peace? Or were there darker elements hidden beneath the surface? In Sumer, as in Babylon, the goal wasn't to create a society where crime was completely eradicated, because, let's face it, even today, no place is entirely free from wrongdoing. Instead, the Sumerians aimed to create a system where crimes were dealt with in a way that was fair and restorative. So, when someone committed a crime, their punishment wasn't necessarily meant to be a public spectacle of violence. It was a means of restoring peace and order. If someone committed a theft, for example, the punishment would often involve the return of stolen goods and a fine to compensate the victim. Murder, however, was a more serious crime and required significant restitution to the family of the victim. In the most severe cases, a person's life could be taken, but the focus was still on maintaining balance, restoring what had been lost, rather than exacting revenge. Historians still debate whether these punishments were truly as peaceful as they seem. Some argue that the legal system, especially in Babylon, served more to reinforce the power of the elite, with punishments that disproportionately affected the lower classes. For example, slaves were subjected to much harsher punishments than free citizens. A slave might face execution for a crime, while a free person could pay a fine. It raises the question, was the legal system fair, or was it just another tool for the elites to control the masses? The discrepancy in punishments between the classes is a point of contention that historians still argue about. Yet, there's an argument to be made that the Sumerian and Babylonian systems, in their own way, were still revolutionary. By creating a legal framework based on restitution, the goal was to prevent cycles of retaliation. In many ancient societies, a crime could lead to a feud that spanned generations. But in Sumer and Babylon, the emphasis was on resolving conflict and bringing back balance instead of letting the crime snowball into something more violent. Think about it. A system where punishment is directly related to the crime, where restitution is expected, and where, in some cases, even the lives of the victims' families were compensated. It was a far cry from the arbitrary justice seen in many parts of the ancient world. Sumerians weren't interested in showing power through violence. They were interested in maintaining peace. But we can't ignore the darker aspects of the system either. For example, there were laws dealing with the treatment of slaves, and some of these were quite harsh. If a slave were caught stealing, the punishment could be severe. And in some cases, slaves were even executed for minor infractions. This inequality in the legal system remains one of the most discussed aspects of Sumerian and Babylonian law. While the system helped maintain social order, it also clearly favored the wealthy and the powerful. As you settle into your bed, thinking about ancient Sumer and Babylon, it's important to remember that the legal systems of these societies were both simple and complex, calm and harsh, fair and unequal. These systems, with their combination of divine law, restitution, and restorative justice, formed the backbone of societies that endured for centuries. And while not perfect, they set the stage for how law would evolve, influencing societies far beyond Mesopotamia. Now that we've explored the complexities of punishments and social balance, let's take a step back and consider how the Sumerians and Babylonians kept their legal systems organized. One of the most important tools they had was something that, to us, might seem almost mundane, but was absolutely revolutionary in the time: written records. In a world where oral tradition was still the norm, the Sumerians and Babylonians created a system where everything was documented, and that documentation, through the use of cuneiform script, helped create a peaceful society in a way that we may not fully appreciate today. Imagine yourself in Sumer, walking through a bustling market. Everywhere you look, people are talking, trading, and exchanging goods. But amid all this activity, there's a quiet hum of something else happening, a hum of documentation. Every transaction, every contract, every agreement was being recorded. And who was doing the recording? The scribes. These scribes were the lifeblood of Sumerian society, the ones responsible for keeping the system running smoothly, ensuring that laws were upheld, debts were paid, and peace was maintained. Historians often point to the creation of writing as one of the most transformative moments in human history, and for good reason. In Sumer, writing wasn't just for recording religious texts or royal decrees. It was also for keeping track of everyday life. This meant that laws were not just spoken or passed down through generations. They were written down and could be referred to at any time. Imagine a system where you could actually point to a written law and say, "This is what the gods want," instead of relying on someone's memory or interpretation. But let's take a closer look at how this worked in practice. Sumerians used cuneiform script, which was initially a system of pictographs, and later evolved into a series of wedge-shaped symbols. These symbols were pressed into clay tablets, which were then baked to preserve the information. In a way, every clay tablet was like a tiny piece of history, a snapshot of a moment in time when the law was being enforced, or a transaction was taking place. And because these records were stored in temples, palaces, and libraries, they became the official documentation of Sumerian society. Historians still debate how widely literacy was spread in ancient Sumer. Some argue that only a small group of elites, priests, scribes, and royalty could read and write, while others suggest that literacy was more widespread, especially among merchants and traders. Either way, the important thing was that the written word allowed for consistency and accountability. People couldn't just argue about what was said in a court. There was a physical record. This, in turn, created a sense of security. People knew that if they had a dispute, there was a way to track it down and resolve it through the written word. And what's more calming than knowing that your word will be preserved for posterity? You could enter a dispute knowing that the facts were going to be recorded, ensuring that both parties had an equal chance at justice. This was a far cry from societies where oral traditions led to discrepancies and confusion. The written word provided clarity, and clarity created peace. But let's take a step into Babylon now, where Hammurabi's code would have also been written down on large stone tablets. Unlike the small clay tablets of Sumer, Hammurabi's laws were carved into massive public stelae, meant to be seen by everyone who passed by. These stelae were placed in public spaces, and they weren't just for the rich or the powerful to look at. They were for everyone, giving the common people, as well as the elite, direct access to the laws that govern them. Historians argue that this public display of law was an important step in keeping the peace. When people knew what the laws were and how they were going to be applied, they were less likely to feel that they were being unjustly punished or overlooked. There was something inherently peaceful about this visibility. No longer could a king or priest decide the fate of an individual behind closed doors. Now, the entire society could see what was happening, which led to greater accountability. And so, as you imagine these ancient societies, picture the scribes writing down every word, every law, and every dispute. The presence of written records ensured that justice, while not always perfect, was at least consistent. And in a world that was often unpredictable, consistency and clarity were the building blocks of peace. Now that we've explored the role of written records and how they helped maintain peace, let's look at one of the most underrated yet vital parts of the Sumerian and Babylonian legal systems: the scribes themselves. These men and women, often unseen but absolutely essential, were the architects of the judicial system. They were the ones who not only recorded laws and transactions, but also ensured that the laws were followed. So, let's pause and think about them for a moment, because without scribes, there would be no written law, no public records, and no means of ensuring that peace was maintained in the way it was. Imagine this. You're sitting in a bustling city in ancient Sumer or Babylon. The heat of the day presses down on the crowded streets. The scent of spices and cattle mingles in the air, and merchants are haggling over goods. But amidst this busy scene, the scribes are quietly working in the background. They sit at wooden desks in cool, shaded rooms, their hands pressing stylus to clay, carefully crafting cuneiform characters into tablets that will record everything from personal contracts to judicial decisions. They are the unseen keepers of peace. Without them, the entire system would fall apart. Historians still debate the true role of scribes in these societies. Were they simply record keepers, or did they have more power than we realize? The fact that scribes could document disputes, transactions, and even the king's decrees means they were in a unique position to influence the course of events. After all, if a scribe made a mistake in the records, it could alter the outcome of a trial or a business deal. In a sense, scribes held the power to shape the future of a society, all through the power of the written word. But let's look beyond their influence and into the day-to-day lives of these scribes. They were part of an elite group, trained from a young age to read and write in cuneiform, a skill that was far from easy. Cuneiform wasn't just a system of letters. It was a complex language of symbols and signs that could express entire concepts, ideas, and laws. To become a scribe, one had to undergo years of rigorous education, and only a select few could afford to do so. Scribes were often associated with the temples or royal courts, and their work was seen as both sacred and vital to the functioning of the state. The fact that the Sumerians and Babylonians put such a heavy emphasis on record-keeping shows just how important the judicial system was to them. Without written documentation, there would be no way to ensure that laws were applied consistently, no way to hold people accountable, and no way to settle disputes peacefully. The scribes, in a very real sense, were the peacekeepers of the ancient world, ensuring that everything was recorded, from debts to legal judgments to personal agreements. Yet, there's a curious element of mystery surrounding the scribes. Historians still argue whether they were simply tools of the state or whether they wielded some sort of quiet power. Were they mere servants of the law, or did they shape the law itself? After all, who better to know the nuances of the law than the people who wrote it down? It's an intriguing question that we'll never fully answer, but it's clear that the scribes played a far more important role in maintaining peace than we might imagine. Now, think about what it must have been like for a scribe, sitting in the cool shade, the sounds of the city faint in the distance as they carefully inscribed each letter, each word. Every action, every decision, every dispute in the society they lived in was passed through their hands, and they didn't just preserve the past, they helped shape the future. Their work, while quiet and often unseen, was a key piece of the peaceful judicial system in Sumer and Babylon. So, as you imagine the city streets once again, consider that, just beneath the surface of this bustling society, there were these quiet, steady hands keeping track of everything. It's almost a comforting thought, isn't it? The scribes, with their steady hands and sharp minds, were the unsung heroes of the ancient legal world, ensuring that peace wasn't just a lofty ideal, but a practical, everyday reality. Now that we've seen how essential scribes were in maintaining the legal and judicial system, let's turn our attention to a critical and often murky aspect of the Sumerian and Babylonian legal world: debt and slavery. These were not just personal tragedies or unfortunate circumstances. They were deeply embedded in the structure of society. Debt, in particular, played a major role in the Sumerian and Babylonian economies, and how the legal systems dealt with it reveals much about their approach to justice and peacekeeping. So, let's imagine what it must have been like to live in a world where debt could mean the difference between prosperity and servitude. Imagine you're a farmer in ancient Sumer, working the land day after day. You've planted your crops, but a bad harvest leaves you struggling to pay off a loan you took out to buy seed and tools. The city is bustling with life, but for you, everything feels like it's slipping through your fingers. In Sumer, the legal system offered you a way out, but it came at a high price. If you couldn't pay your debts, you might find yourself or your family sold into slavery to settle the account. Slavery, as harsh as it was, became a reality for many Sumerians and Babylonians who fell on hard times. Historians still argue about the extent to which slavery was used in these ancient societies. Was it a temporary solution, a way to balance the economy when things went wrong? Or was it a deeply ingrained part of the social structure that made inequality more pronounced? While we may never have a clear answer, it's clear that debt was a major factor in both the creation of and the enforcement of slavery. If you were a person in debt, you could end up being forced into labor for a creditor until your debt was paid off. But it wasn't just individuals who were affected. Entire families could be trapped in this cycle, where the pursuit of wealth for one party led to the ruin of another. But not all was grim. The legal systems of Sumer and Babylon included mechanisms designed to protect those who fell into debt. In both civilizations, there were laws in place that prevented permanent enslavement due to debt. For example, in Sumer, the laws allowed for a set period of servitude, often limited to a few years, after which a person would be freed. Babylon's legal system followed a similar approach, with Hammurabi's code introducing the concept of a jubilee year, where debts were forgiven and people were released from servitude. These laws were important because they showed that while debt could create hardship, there was still a structure in place to prevent complete devastation and to offer hope for those who had fallen into the trap of financial ruin. This was a far cry from the harsh, lifelong slavery seen in other parts of the ancient world. For Sumerians and Babylonians, the idea was not to punish indefinitely, but to restore balance and peace. The fact that debts were forgiven and people were given a chance to rebuild their lives is a testament to the peaceful undercurrent of their judicial systems. The focus wasn't on vengeance, but on ensuring that peace could be restored, even for those who had been brought low by misfortune. Historians still debate the effectiveness of these laws. Some argue that they didn't do enough to prevent the rise of inequality, while others point to them as an early form of social welfare, aimed at keeping society from falling into total chaos. Regardless, it's clear that the Sumerians and Babylonians viewed debt and slavery as social issues that needed to be addressed by the law, and they built a legal system that acknowledged the need for compassion, balance, and peace. Imagine living in a society where, if you fell into debt, there was still a legal path to freedom. It's a comforting thought, isn't it? That even in the face of hardship, there was a system designed not to break you but to help restore balance in your life. That's the kind of society the Sumerians and Babylonians sought to build. A society where, even in the worst of times, peace and fairness were always within reach. Now that we've delved into the complexities of debt and slavery in ancient Sumer and Babylon, let's step back and look at one of the most important aspects of the legal systems that often gets overlooked: how the Sumerians and Babylonians resolved disputes. In most modern societies, we're used to thinking of courts as the main venue for resolving conflict. But in these ancient civilizations, the situation was far more fluid. Courtrooms weren't necessarily where all disputes were settled. In fact, many conflicts were handled outside of formal courts, through alternative methods of dispute resolution that focused on peacekeeping and reconciliation rather than punishment. Picture yourself walking through the streets of Sumer or Babylon. The sun is setting, and you hear the murmurs of voices rising from a nearby market. The sound of an argument reaches your ears, two merchants disputing over a trade. Most people would expect the matter to end up in front of a judge, but that wasn't always the case. In fact, many disputes in Sumer and Babylon were settled through mediation rather than formal legal proceedings. Mediation, in this context, was about finding a peaceful resolution that both parties could agree to, and the goal wasn't punishment, but rather the restoration of peace and balance. Historians still debate how effective these methods were in practice. Were they always fair? Was everyone given equal opportunity to have their voices heard? While we can't know for sure, we do know that mediation was seen as an important tool for maintaining peace within the community. And the idea of using negotiation to resolve disputes was far more prevalent than you might expect in a world where conflict was a daily reality. Imagine that. Instead of a lengthy legal battle, two parties might simply sit down with a neutral third party, a mediator, and come to a resolution. This way, the social fabric remained intact, and people could move on with their lives without the lingering tensions that often come from a formal trial. Another important aspect of dispute resolution in Sumer and Babylon was the role of the community in maintaining order. In many cases, the entire neighborhood or community would play a role in resolving conflicts. This collective approach to justice helped ensure that everyone had a stake in keeping the peace. It also created a strong social bond, as people worked together to make sure that everyone followed the same rules and agreements. It wasn't just the ruler or the judge who was responsible for maintaining order. It was a shared responsibility among all citizens. Interestingly, there's also evidence that, in some cases, the Sumerians and Babylonians used religious rituals as part of their dispute resolution process. If a conflict couldn't be resolved through mediation or community action, the parties involved might turn to the gods for guidance. This could involve offerings, sacrifices, or prayers to invoke divine judgment, which added another layer of authority to the legal system. Imagine that. Disputes were sometimes settled with a mixture of human logic, community involvement, and divine intervention. It's not quite the courtroom drama we might picture today, but it was a system designed to ensure that peace could be maintained even when tensions were high. Yet, despite all these peaceful methods, there were still moments when conflicts escalated and violence broke out. It's inevitable, isn't it? Even the most peaceful systems have their flaws. But the fact that Sumer and Babylon had these alternative methods of dispute resolution shows that their legal systems were designed with a long-term view of peace, rather than simply focusing on punishment or retribution. The key was to resolve conflicts in a way that restored harmony to society, rather than deepening divisions. So, as you lie back, imagine a world where disputes didn't always lead to courtroom battles or public executions. Instead, people sat down together, worked things out, and found peaceful resolutions that allowed them to continue living in their communities. It's a world that seems far removed from the often dramatic ways we handle disputes today. But it was a world built on the same principle, that peace is worth fighting for. And sometimes, the fight happens quietly in the spaces between the loud arguments and the public trials. As we approach the later stages of our journey through ancient Sumer and Babylon, it's time to acknowledge a fundamental truth. No civilization, no matter how peaceful, is immune to decline. Even in societies built on a foundation of law, order, and divine justice, the pressures of time, change, and external threats can disrupt the most carefully constructed systems. As Sumer began to decline, the judicial system it had so carefully built was tested in ways it hadn't been before. Picture this: the once thriving cities of Sumer, now aging and crumbling, as invasions from neighboring peoples start to chip away at their power, the sounds of war drums echoing on the horizon, a reminder that the balance they had worked so hard to establish might not last forever. And yet, in the midst of this turmoil, the Sumerians still clung to their legal traditions, even as they began to break down. It was a testament to the strength of their peaceful judicial system that, even as their empire faded, many of their laws and practices continued to influence future civilizations. Historians still argue about what exactly led to the decline of Sumer. Some suggest it was the invasion of the Akkadians and other neighboring peoples, while others argue that internal strife and economic pressures played a role. What is clear, however, is that the legal system, once a model of peace and order, began to falter as Sumer's political and economic stability weakened. The elite became increasingly corrupt, and the once sacred balance between the rulers and the ruled was gradually undermined. As the Sumerians fell under the control of the Akkadians, who would go on to form their own empire, the peaceful judicial system that had defined Sumer was no longer the central force it once was. The Akkadians, while continuing many of the same legal practices, brought their own systems of governance, which were more focused on centralized control and military power. The balance that the Sumerians had once maintained through law and order began to shift toward a more autocratic rule, where the king's word was law, and the needs of the common people took a back seat to the ambitions of the elite. But despite the decline of the Sumerian civilization itself, the influence of its legal system did not fade away completely. In fact, it continued to echo through the ages. The idea of written laws, publicly displayed and enforced by appointed judges, became a cornerstone of future legal systems. Even the idea of restitution over punishment, which had been so central to Sumerian law, would influence later civilizations, including those in Greece and Rome. Imagine the last days of Sumer. The ziggurats still stand tall, the temples and palaces still glisten in the sun, but there's a quiet desperation in the air. The once great legal system is crumbling, but the lessons it imparted remain. Even in the face of decline, the Sumerians held on to their belief in fairness, balance, and peace, values that would continue to shape future legal systems long after the fall of their civilization. The Sumerians had a profound influence on the way that laws could create and maintain peace. But, like all civilizations, they couldn't escape the inevitable changes that come with time. The key takeaway, however, is this: even in decline, the laws of Sumer remained a model for peace, a quiet reminder of how justice can help keep a society together, even in its darkest days. Even though the Sumerians and their legal framework may have faded with the fall of their empire, their influence on the development of law did not disappear. Instead, the ideas they pioneered were picked up by succeeding civilizations, transforming the ways in which societies govern themselves. The legacies of Sumerian law, especially the principle of publicly displayed laws and the idea of restitution, left an indelible mark on legal systems throughout history. In many ways, these ancient legal systems paved the way for the future, from the mighty Roman Empire to modern legal systems that govern much of the world today. let's take a moment to reflect on how Sumer's innovations influenced the world around it. As the Akkadian Empire rose to power, it absorbed many aspects of Sumerian law, including the concept of written laws. This tradition of codifying laws would continue with the Babylonians, most famously through Hammurabi's Code, which borrowed heavily from Sumer's practices. Hammurabi's laws, although more centralized and severe, carried forward the idea of creating a public and permanent record of laws for all to see. This was a direct inheritance from Sumer, where laws were etched into clay tablets and displayed for the public to read. As time passed, civilizations such as the Greeks and Romans, who were later influenced by the Babylonians, took these ideas even further. The Romans, for instance, developed a more sophisticated system of written laws known as the 12 Tables, which were publicly displayed for all to see. They too believed in the importance of creating a legal system that everyone could understand and follow, an idea that had its roots in the Sumerian system of public display and transparency. The concept of eye for an eye, present in both Hammurabi's and Sumerian codes, would find its way into many future legal traditions as a means of ensuring fairness and proportional justice. However, the idea of restitution rather than vengeance, a core principle of Sumerian law, continued to resonate, evolving over time into modern concepts of compensatory justice. Today, we see this principle reflected in the way modern legal systems focus on reparations and compensations, especially in civil cases, as a way of restoring balance between parties rather than meting out physical punishment. Historians still argue whether the Sumerians truly understood the lasting impact of their legal innovations, or whether it was simply a matter of practical governance. Did they foresee that their laws would influence future societies for thousands of years? Or were they simply trying to keep their own society peaceful and functional? Whatever the case, what's clear is that their methods provided the foundation for a more universal idea of justice, one that extended beyond any particular civilization and reached across the ages. As we reflect on the legacy of Sumerian law, it's important to recognize that their system wasn't perfect, but it was groundbreaking. It wasn't just about maintaining order. It was about fostering a peaceful and stable society where the people should live with a clear understanding of right and wrong. The fact that Sumer's influence persisted, even through the rise and fall of empires, speaks to the effectiveness and the enduring wisdom behind their legal principles. The peace they strive for wasn't simply a dream. It was a tangible system they built, piece by piece, over centuries. As you drift into a deeper sleep, imagine how these ancient laws, written in the sand and on clay tablets, continued to echo down through the corridors of time. The principles of peace, fairness, and balance, once created in the heart of Sumer, would eventually spread to the furthest reaches of the known world. From Sumer's quiet streets to Rome's grand forums, the idea of justice, calm, methodical, and restorative, remains an anchor in the chaotic sea of human history. As we reach the final chapter of our journey through ancient Sumer and Babylon, it's time to slow down and reflect on the lasting legacy of these civilizations and their legal systems. The Sumerians, with their focus on fairness, balance, and peace, created a model that has endured across millennia, influencing not just the ancient world, but the way we understand law and justice today. While their civilization may have faded, the principles they laid out for maintaining order and resolving conflict resonate in many legal systems across the globe. Imagine a world without laws, a world where everything is chaotic, where might makes right, and where disputes are resolved with violence or vengeance. It's hard to even fathom, isn't it? Yet, in Sumer, the seeds of order were sown. The Sumerians showed us that the key to a peaceful society wasn't just about controlling the people, it was about creating a system of justice that worked for everyone. They built a society where laws were written down, where people knew what to expect, and where disputes could be resolved without resorting to bloodshed. The Sumerians weren't just creating a set of laws, they were establishing a philosophy of peace. It's a philosophy that recognizes that human nature is often frail, but that with the right systems in place, we can create harmony. The legal systems they developed were grounded in the idea that justice should be fair, that punishment should be proportional, and that peace should be the ultimate goal. They may not have had the technological advances we take for granted today, but they understood something fundamental. Without justice, there is no peace. It's easy to dismiss the past as something irrelevant to our modern lives, but the more we look at the legal systems of ancient civilizations like Sumer, the more we realize how much they shaped the world we live in. The idea of public laws accessible to everyone was revolutionary. The practice of mediation and dispute resolution that didn't require force or violence was a peaceful approach that could teach us something even today. As you drift into a peaceful sleep tonight, remember that the world we live in, the laws, the fairness, the balance, didn't come from nowhere. It's the result of thousands of years of human struggle, innovation, and vision. From the quiet scribes of Sumer to the grand legal codes of Hammurabi, the thread of justice has woven through human history, quietly guiding us toward a more peaceful and balanced world. And perhaps, in this fast-paced world, it's worth pausing and reflecting on these ancient lessons. We may not be living in the ancient cities of Sumer or Babylon, but the ideals they cultivated, peace, balance, and fairness, still guide us today. Their legal systems weren't perfect, but they were an attempt to create order and harmony in a world that often seemed chaotic. And maybe, just maybe, the calm they worked so hard to establish is something we can all aspire to in our own lives and societies. Now, as you prepare to rest, think of the peaceful streets of ancient Sumer, quiet, calm, and full of the promise of balance. The legacy of Sumer's peaceful judicial system may be ancient, but its lessons are timeless. And as you drift into your dreams, remember that peace is not just a distant ideal. It's something that can be created. One law, one act of fairness, one moment of balance at a time.